Captain Jack, Ron, Captain Flint, Brain Trust, Earl Sanderson, Silver Helix, Chop Chop, Young Troll, Stopwatch, Will-O-Wisp, Turtle, and Xavier Desmond.
Hello, welcome to Card Table. So last time out, I was geeking out about shaking up the reading order of wild cards, and so as long as I'm on that topic, I'm still kind of ready to geek out about it. So let's skip ahead a little. Volume 16, which is called Deuces Down, and Volume 17, which is called Death Draws 5. And let's also talk about Volume 18, which is called... or let's look at the ones that bracket it. So 15, which is Black Trump, and 18, which is Inside Straight, right? All these titles are just sort of so, not all of them, but so many of them feel a little meaningless. If you know, Inside Straight is really, it's just poker lingo. It doesn't really clue you into what the book is about. So it's not, there's no mnemonic to help you remember some of these titles, but I just know because I read them so many times. But so the span from 15, 16, 17 to 18 is a chaotic sort of span in the wild cards timeline and the publishing order, because 15 was published by Baen. That's how I want to pronounce it, Baen, Baen Publishing. It was the last of 3 books to be published by Baen, and then they hopped publishers again to. And then that was actually the end of wild cards for a while, or it certainly seemed like a while to me. When you look back at the publishing dates, it was 7 years, which now that I'm older, I feel like 7 years kind of goes by in the blink of an eye. But back then it was like 7 years without a wild cards book. Wild cards must be, defunct, which I guess it theoretically maybe almost was, but sort of found a new lease on life when they hooked up with a new publisher called iBooks. They did publish, they had a contract for 2 books, and they did publish both those books, but then the publisher folded like kind of immediately after that, through no fault of wild cards, but just the timing of it, I guess, was very strange, where they sort of published the second wild cards book and then went out of business just like that. So that was Deuces Down and Death Draws 5, and then there was another hiatus, because I'm trying to think what the publishing dates were. So 95 for Black Trump, 2002 for iBooks Deuces Down. I want to say maybe 2006 for the next one, maybe 2006 for Death Draws 5, and then 2008 for Inside Straight. So I guess there wasn't as big a time gap there, but they did have to jump to a new publisher again, which was Tor, which is who they're still with now. So over the course of 4 books, 3 publishers from Baen for that last Baen book to 2 from iBooks, and then to the first Tor volume. In a large span of time, right? So 1995 for Black Trump, so 4 books over the course of 13 years. And since wild cards kind of moves along in real time, if you're sort of kind of following the wild card saga as it unfolds, year after year in a sort of parallel with the real world, the 80s are very well explored, because during the 80s there was just one wild card book after another, and just kind of going like almost month by month through the 1980s. And then suddenly there's kind of a gap where Black Trump is set, I mentioned before they kind of run on a 1 or 2 year delay. So you figure Black Trump is like the wild cards universe circa 1994 AD, and then after a few books, all of a sudden you've jumped into the year 2008 in the wild cards universe, and not much in between, right? So 2002's volume, Deuces Down. So originally this comes out from iBooks, and it's an anthology with no real narrative thread. In the past, if you've watched some of the earlier videos, or you're just someone who's already familiar with the books, those anthologies where it's whenever they have just a book of short stories, there's something tying together what they call the interstitial narrative, and what George R. R. Martin has also called kind of the mortar. If the stories are the bricks, then the interstitial narrative is the mortar to hold them together and make it feel more novelistic. Deuces Down doesn't have anything like that. It's very kind of thin on the ground, just 7 stories, which is a light amount of stories anyway for a Wildcards book. I think 9 to 12 is a little more the norm. So to only have 7, I remember after wait, I wasn't on pins and needles for those entire 7 years, but certainly when I found out it was coming back after 7 years, I was like very excited. And when it was only 7 stories, that felt a little slender. But it's one of those I mentioned last time that it takes place in different. So you also don't really get much in the sense of what's been happening since the day of the stories or the story told in Black Trump. 7 years later, what's the Wildcard universe been up to? You don't really get much of those answers because the anthology also goes back in time. So the first story set in the 60s, or the first couple stories are set in the 60s, and then a couple in the 70s, a couple in the 80s, whatever. And only the very last one is set, circa the present. And it's great. I remember emailing Kevin Andrew Murphy at the time, telling him how much I really enjoyed his story because it was so cool that I think he was the right choice to show the present day of the Wildcard universe because he really knows his continuity. So he was able to put in a lot of Easter eggs for longtime fans who wanted to return to this world. So no complaints about the quality there. Just my complaint is only about the quantity. Right, seven stories and only one set in the present was not enough for me personally. But so then you jump to Death Draws 5, which was one of the few solo novels where just one writer comes along and does a story. So John Joseph Miller writes Death Draws 5, and it's set. I'd have to check my timeline notes. It came out in 2006, and I think it's set in 2003. Yeah, that's what it is. So you do get a little more progress, and that's a fun novel because there's a few long time favorite characters who are able to show up. Meanwhile, some new characters get to debut, and I'll get more to this when I talk about the actual story, since I'm more talking about the chronology here. But there's a character who is literally born in all the way back in like volume 5, which is set in 87, and is sort of prophesized. I might have talked a little about is John Fortune. He's sort of prophesized to be an important character, but since Wildcards goes in real time, it's like, well, he was born in 87, so you can't really do much with that guy until he has some time to age. And now, sort of fortuitously, you've got a book set in 2003 where he's 16, and so now maybe he can start to fulfill some of these prophecies about his significance in the Wildcards canon. So kind of a cool. I wrote in one of the I think in one of my Tor.com essays, I think I talked about what a satisfying payoff that was if you were reading at the time. Because at the time it's sort of like it just feels like this seed that maybe is never gonna sprout, because how long would you have to wait for a baby to actually be a character with agency? And because Wildcards is so long-lived, they actually did it. They pulled it off. John Fortune grew to adulthood and sort of fulfilled his narrative destiny, if you will. So he's kind of John Fortune is sort of the focus of Death Draws 5, and then he's also a character in the first Tor book titled Inside Straight, which came out in 2008 or 2007 maybe. Yeah, again I'd have to check my notes. I think Inside Straight is set in 2007. Yeah, so about 4 years after. So if you look at like when their books are set, you got 1994. 2001 for one story, 2003, and then 2007. So again, like I said, you got that sort of 13-year gap in Wildcards publishing, or in the Wildcards timeline, where you don't really know what's happened. So now here's where it gets interesting. 10 minutes in, I'll finally get interesting. Tor re-releases volume 16, and it, like a few books before that one, every so often Tor will do this thing where they will add new stories. They did it with the first volume. They did it with volume 4. They did it with 8, and they did it with 9. And now doing it again with 16. But this is the most extensive. The other ones were really just kind of like, here, we'll just insert 2 or 3 new stories. The book itself doesn't really change that much. It's just there's sort of, almost like deleted scenes were inserted back, even though in this case it's new stuff. It's not stuff that was like deleted from the original, but has that feel, right, of like an extended director's cut or something, where you're still essentially reading the same book, but just with some new things in between the cracks, which is great, and some of those stories are great. But Deuces Down is much more ambitious, where they take those 7 stories, they add 2 more to give you a little thicker book, which addresses my original complaint that there weren't enough stories in there. So there's 2 more, so 9. It feels a little more substantial, right, than just 7. But then, in addition to that, Carrie Vaughn writes an interstitial. Like I said, originally Deuces Down had no mortar for its bricks. It just was 7 stories, kind of in chronological order, with no interstitial connecting them. The only thing that really connected them was that they were in chronological order, like I mentioned, the 60s, 70s, 80s, etc. So Carrie Vaughn gets very ambitious. I assume this was all her idea, although maybe it was something that she discussed with, I should ask. I guess I could ask her. I'll ask her. But, maybe she discussed it with George R. R. Martin and or Melinda Snodgrass, and they... I'd be curious if it was Martin's idea and he spoke to Vaughn about doing it, or if it was Carrie Vaughn's idea and she sort of pitched it. I'm guessing it's that. But so, like I say, very ambitious. So she comes up with this. Not only comes up with this interstitial story, but sort of conceives a way to take those 9 stories that were originally just written in isolation, or 7 of them were written in more or less in isolation. And then you get the 2 new ones, and instead of just presenting them straight chronological through the decades, she mixes them around. Shuffles seems like an on-the-nose term, but she shuffles the stories and puts them in a different order in order to suit the interstitial narrative, or in a way that gives the interstitial narrative a momentum and an arc that makes sense. So pretty clever. And then not only that, as if that weren't ambitious enough, the other thing she does is to have her interstitial take place across several years too, beginning just a little bit before the events of Death Draws 5, which is volume 17. But now, since she has the benefit of hindsight, since this re-release of 16 is coming out after Tor has already put out, volume 18, 19, 20, we're all the way, we're approaching, Joker Moon, which is the 29th book in the series. Not until then did this re-release of 16 come out. So Vaughn is able to, take advantage of hindsight and put all these seeds in the interstitial for future volumes and actually build it up, have it take place starting in 03 and going all the way to 06 or maybe the beginning of 07, essentially right before the start of Inside Straight. So it starts a little bit before volume 17, overtakes it, kind of like what I was talking about in the previous video with the way 10 and 11 work together. So now 16 and 17 have that same momentum now, where even though 16 starts earlier and has a lot of stories set way earlier, the interstitial jumps 17, it jumps Death Draws 5, and actually starts to fill in gaps, and it creates all these setups so that it's a really smooth transition right into volume 18, Inside Straight. And she's even able to put in little seeds of Joker Moon, which, like I said, is all the way in the future, volume 29. But she's able to even put a little Joker Moon foreshadowing in there. So it's really cool. Again, if you're, I don't know how many of us there are, us being wildcard obsessives, but if you are one, it's pretty neat. Very Easter egg heavy and kind of fun to see. And ultimately, she pretty much makes it so that Deuces Down really should be read after Death Draws 5. So this would be the one, and like I said, I mentioned in the previous video about how 4 and 5 kind of have a bit of overlap, and 6 and 7 are sort of simultaneous, and 10 and 11 have their chronological relationship of being a little bit overlappy. But in those cases, I think you're probably as well off as not just reading them in numerical order, even though I'm the geeky one who likes to sort of read them in chronological order. And I'll read a little bit of 5, then read all of 4, and then come back and read the rest of 5. Or I'll read a little bit of 10, then all of 11, then go back and read the rest of 10. I like to do that. I don't necessarily recommend it, but I do have notes about how to do that if you do want to. Hit me up in the comments. Nobody really comments on these videos, but with 16 and 17, with the new version of Deuces Down, which I definitely recommend as way more satisfying than the original version of Deuces Down, I actually do think it makes more sense to read them out of numerical order, i.e. finish Black Trump, which is volume 15, then read 17. Finish Black Trump, book 15, which is set in 1994. Then read Death Draws 5, volume 17, which is set in 2003. And this I have done. I have done it in that order, and it works really nicely. Actually, it works even though it's a 9-year jump in the timeline. It actually it works kind of well. The character of Carnifex, Billy Ray, aka Carnifex, who's one of my favorite characters, John Joseph Miller creations. Definitely, actually, I would say definitely my favorite creation of John Joseph Miller's. He's a lead in Black Trump. He's also a lead in Death Draws 5, and so he's like a great kind of narrative glue. Even though it's a 9-year jump, that works really nicely. So going straight from Black Trump to Death Draws 5 works great. Then I would suggest jumping over to Deuces Down, volume 16, because most of that book, all of this, I mean, the interstitial narrative essentially is post Death Draws 5. So read Deuces Down, which now, like I said, thanks to the new interstitial, starts in 03, but goes through 04, 05, 06, and really takes you, like, towards the end, like, it really just leads so smoothly into volume 18, Inside Straight, which again, if John Joseph Miller and Carnifex are sort of the glue that can kind of take you straight from Black Trump to Death Draws 5, then Carrie Vaughn is the one who massaged it so perfectly so that volume 16, because volume 18 also has a lot of Vaughn's fingerprints on it, since she's the one who kind of came up with the premise for that one about the superhero reality show. They don't call them superheroes in Wildcards, but the superhuman reality show, I guess. And so since that's her premise already, she's able to very, very smoothly start to set that premise up near the end of Deuces Down. And once again, there's a nice just narrative illusion that works really nicely. So this would be the one, well, I won't say the only one. There might be one that comes later, but for at this point in the series, when you're looking at like the first, say, 20 books, and you're just wanting to read them, numerical order works great, but this would be the one example where I think it actually improves the reading experience to flip them. So do it that way. Go 15, 17, 16, 18. Confusing, I know, but Black Trump, Death Draws 5, Deuces Down, Inside Straight. It's the way to go. I think it's the most rewarding way to do it now. And on that note, I'll see you next time.
To try and give our love back some sparks. He said, we'll get your love growing, but before we get going, may I highly recommend Cod Shocks. I like to go out dancing. My baby loves a bunch of authors. Lately we've had some friction, cause my baby's hooked on shared world fiction.